Session this morning on indigeneity and mobility on the plains. Unfortunately, one of our geographers had to drop out at the last minute, and Leila was generous enough to say we could do a session with just her. We appreciate that. I know it's a little hard to stand up here on your own. As we introduced ourselves and the biographies are in here, I won't spend a lot of time introducing the presenters, but please allow me to say a few words about our commenter for this section. Bob Runstrom, my friend, is a professor of human geography here at the University of Oklahoma, where he teaches, among other courses, geography of Oklahoma, American Indian geographies, indigenous peoples, and resources of global survey. So some interesting courses. Bob's own scholarship most recently is addressing resettlement patterns of indigenous peoples and non-Indians, including their cultural origins, their practices, and their maybe distribution. Distribution sounds like a word. Okay. So Bob will offer comments on Leila's paper. And without further ado, here's Leila with her paper.
I am really delighted to be here. Thank you. I have a double training as a linguistic anthropologist and then a born-again historian. And this work comes out of my work with my MA, which was a history of women in the Great Plains Wars. You scratch my watch. I thought that I would start Here we go. I would start by sort of placing my work geographically. The prairie, as has been said, extends from Canada to Texas, but it also extends from sort of western Montana through Illinois. But my particular part of the prairie that I want to look at is the shortgrass prairie, which is the stream that goes from Montana through eastern Wyoming, eastern Colorado, and then sort of north Texas and a little bit of west Oklahoma. And I'm particularly interested in this part because there are affordances that the shortgrass prairie offers that go very well with the, in my case, Cheyenne and Arapaho women's use of travois. Other groups, including the Blackfoot, also use the travois. If you look at the satellite map, you can see that there is the sort of the pale brown color. That's the sort of the prairie, including the sort of mountainous regions of pale brown. So those are the high plains, and that's what I'm particularly interested in. And I got interested in this because this is where I live. So this is a picture of my yard in Laramie, Wyoming, complete with our occasional visitors, the pronghorn antelope. And this is another picture of my yard. And then this is a picture of Sand Creek. And while the pronghorn here is not nearly as healthy, the landscape is remarkably similar, despite the fact that these are hundreds of miles apart from Laramie to southern, southeastern Colorado. When people think of native communities moving across the plains, and when you look at images of native communities across the plains by sort of Cheyenne people themselves, the image is often of men on horseback. This, of course, is contingent upon horses having been entered into the thing. What I would like to do is offer instead a discussion of the implications of women and their travois, and particularly horse travois. Before there were horse travois, there were dog travois, but I think horse travois opened up a sort of geographical space that was not previously available to them. You can see in sort of Euro-Americans' writings about sort of native gatherings that the travois shows up as an important part from the early moments. So, B. Gratz Brown, who was a journalist present at the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty proceedings, talks about how in moving camp, as in all drudgery, everything in the way of labor is performed by the women and the female children. The men and boys do nothing. They regard it as a disgrace to do any kind of work. There's lots of feminist critiques of this particular kind of dialogue, but it's very present. But closely connected to the idea that women were doing this work of the home is on the dragging poles or prairie buggies. They put their lodges, camp equipage, children, and sometimes their dogs. Some have a cool canopy of wickerwork covered with skins, right? The travois was at the heart of women making camp, women making home for the entire community that they were part of. And it's interesting because this is the treaty proceedings, so there's no, it's like the men were the ones that were making the treaty, the men were the ones that were talking to each other, but the women were the ones that were making camp, making home, and the women were the ones that took all the trade goods home. So anything that a woman could carry on the travois went with her. Anything that couldn't, they dumped. It was the women's decisions about what to do with the trade goods, because they were the ones with the technology to move things. What I want to look at in this paper is first a kind of quick review of the literature on travois. Second, a little bit of linguistic geography about how Native people themselves, and particularly Arapaho and Cheyenne people, saw the space that they used. And finally, I want to look at the extensive documentation about the Great Plains Wars to look for evidence of travois and evidence of women's use of them or not. So previous research on the travois. Norman Henderson is the person who's done most research on this, and he did experiments. So his experiments were to take a dog and drag a dog travois across the landscape, and then to take a horse and to drag a horse travois across the landscape. And his quote about how his dog worked, I think, sort of sums up how the shortgrass prairie, that prairie that you find in my yard in Laramie, Wyoming, is ideal for dragging travois sticks across. So the thick mat of dried grass blades gave a resilient spring to the dog's step and cushioned the travois poles. The effect was almost magical, a smooth, apparently frictionless, soundless glide. Such ideal travois conditions were once much more prevalent over the plains and must have been as good as snow cover for travois. And so this quote and other quotes like it, for me, it turns the great American desert into what is essentially a dry river that goes from sort of Oklahoma up through Saskatchewan. That this landscape is completely opened up by the use of travois technology. And it's interesting because there's a couple of different ways of negotiating landscapes with travois. Wooden Leg talks about how when you've got basically open prairie, people spread out because the whole prairie is your pathway, right? So Our trail during all our movements throughout that summer could have been followed by a blind person. It was from a quarter to half a mile wide at all places where the form of the land allowed that width. So Indians regularly made a broad trail when traveling in vans using travois, right? So you have this wide swath, and you just take your horses and you drag your travois. But the travois is not useful in environments that aren't that short grass prairie, right? So Henderson, when he was doing his horse travois experiments, found that even like bush, the projecting ends of the cross poles are liable to catch on anything, right? So if you don't have that smooth grass, you have much more problematic travel. So to go back to my map of the short grass prairie, if you look, for example, at western Wyoming, it's sort of definitely not short grass prairie. Instead, so actually let's go back to, if we look at kind of mixed grass prairie, which is what we have outside the window of the inn that we are staying in. And it's like, I looked at it, it's like, yes! So this is kind of thick for a travois, right? You know, like, so when you look at the mixed grass prairie, that is the eastern limit. When you start getting the sort of the lush grass, you stop being able to move so closely. On the other hand, if you go west, this is western Wyoming, you get this scrub brush. And this, I suspect, is tremendously hard to go through. One of my questions is, did Shoshone women extensively use the travois because they come from this area? And my answer is probably no, but I need to do more research on that. I don't know the answer. But you can see it's a very different landscape than the dry plains that are in my yard. Brandy Bethke's dissertation on Bloodfoot use of horse and horse and dog, which is a nice dissertation from the student. In that dissertation, she recounts the sort of Jim Blood talking about one annual migration that his particular group of Bloodfoot did. This is the sort of the closer model. And you can see that it's a roughly circular pattern. And first of all, you can see that it's mostly going across these open plains, but it's also going to very specific resources that can be found in non-plain areas. So that intersection between where the plains hits other kinds of geography become important. And there's lots of resources mentioned by Blood. I think particularly important here are plants, including choke cherries, cypress hills, lodge poles, the lodge poles that made the travois poles, gooseberries, red willow berries, sweetgrass, tobacco. All of these different kinds of resources were things that people got by moving from one place to another. Steve Platt's thesis for the University of Wyoming looked at the northern Bighorn Mountains, and he found 5 different specific travois trails, 2 Sioux and 3 Crow going through the mountains. And I think that's a sort of indication of a similar use of mountain resources combined with prairie resources. And when you look at literature on culture of the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, you can see how this is not just something used at one point in your life, but is a theme that runs throughout the life, throughout the culture, particularly women's culture. So George Bird Grinnell describes Cheyenne girls' play. And he talks about in children's play camps, the girls used tiny lodge poles, often the tall weed sticks that are used for windbreaks around the lodge, and the boys sometimes acted as horses and dragged the lodgepoles or hauled travois with little babies on them, right? So Cheyenne children are thinking about travois from this very young age. It is the play that they grow up with. And they often used dogs as these sort of, whereas the dog travois went out for grown-up women, they stayed in use for particularly girl children. I love this image. This comes from Kroeber's 1902 work on artwork in amongst the Arapaho at this point in the Wind River Reservation. And when you look at Kroeber's description of this, he's just describing how these triangles or teepees, how the iconography in the middle is the North Star, how the lines are in the middle river. So here we have some water, we've got grass, we've got animals. But when you look at this, you realize, with the idea of kind of women's mobility, you realize that this is a picture of coming from down at the bottom. You can see camps along a river, which is the way people camp in the river. And then you see these movements, the double lines of travois, up a middle river, following a river to the sort of summer camp. In iconography, squares and circles are very similar. And so what you have here is a picture of going from winter camping to summer camping, right? And for me, this image is so important because it places the woman who did it as a traveler, right? That you can see in this a mobile man, sort of mindset. This is a woman who thought about space, who cared about space, who did her art about space, and about movement across that space with travois. Okay, so a couple of takeaways from this section. Travois allowed women to move households across wide distances. Short grass prairie is the ideal medium. Travois had trouble in bushlands. Groups traveled across prairie lands to a different variety of sources. Prairie paths are general. Non-prairie routes are specific and sometimes marked with cairns. That comes out of Steve Platt's work. Work with travois infused all parts of women's lives, including the lives of girls. And women thought of themselves as traveling through a world from and to specific kinds of sites, something that is reflected in their artwork. Next, I sort of want to look briefly at the linguistic geographies, including what are the territories covered by the Cheyenne and Arapaho, and what were the important resources. I looked at Grinnell's 1907 Cheyenne stream names, and he talked about tributaries connected to three major tributaries of the Mississippi: the Missouri, the Arkansas, and then the Red River. So the Missouri River is the northernmost limit of sort of Cheyenne territory in this case, right? So running up through kind of northern Missouri, you have like only one place name that's above that. Arkansas River runs straight through the middle of Texas. And you have, so right middle of Kansas, right? So you have sort of groups and notices coming off. And then in the southern territory, you have the Red River, which of course is the border between sort of Texas and Oklahoma. Notice that the Washita is just at the sort of the southern edge of this range. When you kind of put together these major tributaries, you can see that the Missouri is the northern and eastern range. and then the Red River is the southern range, and then the Rocky Mountains are the western extent. Now, when you look at place names, you don't find that many plants mentioned, right? You know, as opposed to the sort of the Bloodfoot list, you only have hackberries and roseberries as food-bearing plants. You have other sort of kinds of resources mentioned, but not much food. This is modern northern Arapaho place names that in part reflects the fact that they now live off of the traditional prairie in kind of western Wyoming. And so these include Wyoming, Colorado, and then one place in Utah that is sort of known as the Battle, where they sort of battled the Utes. When you look at sort of Colorado place names in Arapaho, again, you have very few food sources. So you have bulberries and white turnips, but most are animals of some kind or another, or other materials, including teepee poles. And one of my arguments is that men probably had a different range than women. So, for example, both the Cheyenne and Arapaho are traditionally bison hunting groups, buffalo hunting groups, and the extent of the buffalo herds was massive, right? So if you have men chasing the buffalo, they go all over the place, right? They go places where a travois cannot reach. The buffalo were certainly on the sort of short grass prairie. That was one of the habitats. But as we saw yesterday in the museum, they were comfortable in many more habitats than just the short grass prairie. So a couple of takeaways. The range from the Missouri River to the Red River, the place names seem to be based more on animals and natural features than foodstuffs. And then this brings up a question about whether male and female territories are the same. All male or mostly male hunting bands, women certainly hunted with men sometimes, and war bands may have had a broader territory than women with a travois full of household goods. And this is reinforced by the different maps for buffalo territory and short grass prairie. Finally, I want to tie this into my starting place for this, which is the history of the Plains Indian Wars. So to go back to my prairie map, when you look at that prairie map, one of the interesting things is that important battles or attacks for the Cheyenne and Arapaho women happened in short grass prairie areas. So remember me talking at the beginning about Fort Laramie, how in 1851 there's reports of women using travois at the Fort Laramie talks, right? So Fort Laramie is the lower right-hand corner. So right near 26, right there, right? So squarely in short grass Wyoming prairie lands. So, to go back to this prairie buggy quote. At the 1851 treaty, the Cheyenne and Arapaho were given a large portion of land that included Denver, that basically follows the contours of the short grass prairie in southern Wyoming and sort of middle of Colorado. When you look at the Sand Creek Massacre, right, the Sand Creek Massacre happens right at the southern portion of that land that had been given, right? So the sort of Black Kettles group was squarely within the land that they had been allowed to use according to the 1851 territory. And you can see from this 1936 image that Sand Creek is, as you can see at that picture of that sort of bedraggled pronghorn, it is this short grass dry prairie. So this is sort of like well within where women could have gotten with their travois. And the Sand Creek's, sort of looking at massacres, Sand Creek is one of the most blood-curdling, right? So all matters of depredations were inflicted upon their persons. They were scalped, their brains knocked out. Men used their knives, ripped open women, clubbed little children, knocked them in their heads with their guns, beat their brains out, and mutilated their bodies in every sense of the word. It was beyond horrific. Now, one of the sort of interesting things, though, is how you couldn't take your household goods in this stuff. This was a case of people running for their lives. So this is a letter written to a congressional committee by Edmund Guerrier, who's the grown son of the top Toysonen and a sort of American, French, Canadian trader. So he wrote that the squaws in my lodge, right, he's living in some woman's house here, looked out and then called to me to get up. There are a lot of soldiers coming. Artillerymen began firing with their rifles and pistols. I struck out. I went northeast. I ran about 5 miles when I came across an Indian woman driving a herd of ponies, some 10 or 15. I got a pony. She was a cousin of mine, one of White Antelope's daughters. I went on with her to the Smoky Mountain. Here you have a woman fleeing for her life with her horses, but she didn't have time to pack up her house. She didn't have time to do anything but run out and then run to her horses. George Bent described it as the worst of his life. He's wounded in the fight, but finally sort of catches up with his relatives. He talks about how few were found alive. The soldiers had done their work thoroughly. But now and then, during that endless night, some man or woman would stagger in amongst us, carrying some wounded person on their back, right? This is another case where if they had travois, they would have used them. But you couldn't use your travois because you had to dismantle your house to make the travois. In Washita, you have a similar kind of people running for their lives. George Custer was careful to try not to kill women. He only captured and raped them, which is an improvement in this horrific litany of things. You have Kate Bighead, for example, talk about it was early morning when the soldiers began the shooting. There had been a big storm and there was snow on the ground. All of us jumped from our beds and started running to get away. I was barefooted, as were most of the others. Again, this is a case where there was no chance to get ready. You just ran out into the storm, running away from the bullets. Now, it's interesting that this is Washita, which is, remember I sort of pointed it out as just north of the Red River, right? And Washita is on what is now the Cheyenne arena. And I think it is a sort of mark of the southernmost place that travois can go. Time are in the Wind River Reservation in western Wyoming. But this is the northernmost extent of Cheyenne territory. They're living in circular camps. This is a map drawn a year later by somebody who sort of worked well with many Native American groups, and you can see it in the leather work that I showed earlier. And you can see that this is short grass prairie. Here it's a sort of a reenactment. It's pretty green at this point. In kind of June when Little Bighorn takes place, it's pretty green, but it's still short grass prairie that you can get. Trev the Hunkapapa had labored to make ready for the march that we were going to take up that morning. The village by Greasy Grass was but a stopping place for a day or two, and we had no thought of a fight with the white man. But we were to move out northwestward, and I had made many bundles of my store, right? So this is basically a woman had packed up her house and was ready to move in the morning. But that it took her all night, right? Travois could drag about 200 pounds of goods, but it took time to pack up that 200 pounds of goods. So this gives a kind of makes some sense of why the women in Sand Creek and Washita couldn't get the Travois, because it took all night for Pretty White Buffalo to pack that up. Cheyenne Cape Bighead gives another kind of set of uses for the Travois. I went riding among the Indians at different places on the battlefields in search of my nephew, Noisy Walking. I found him in a deep gulch. I stayed with him while a young man, friend, went to the camps to tell his mother. Here you have a woman riding a horse, not on a Travois. You don't just drag a Travois if you're going out to figure out what your nephew's doing, right? Women from many families brought lodge-troll Travois dragged by ponies to take away the dead or wounded Indians. Some of the women, mourning for their own dead, beat and cut dead bodies of the white men. Noisy Walking's mother and her sister came to get him. We put him upon the Travois bed and took him across the river to our camp. Right? So here, Travois is specifically the ambulance of the Native American. Noisy Wounding is wounded. Noisy Walking is wounded. He later dies that night, but not because he didn't have the best medical care that he could get at that moment. And that medical care included bringing him out of the gulch on that Travois. So women are certainly using this Travois in a really wide sort of set of ways. But you couldn't just, sort of hitch up the Travois and go. You had to do unpacking to make that Travois available in most cases. And what's interesting is that the Northern Cheyenne reservation is right next to the Crow Reservation where Little Bighorn happened. And so you can see that the geography of the plains, the geography of the Travois, not only helps us understand how the Great Plains War played out for the Cheyenne, but also helps us understand the geography of today's Cheyenne groups in sort of Oklahoma in the south and then Montana in the north. So a couple of final takeaways. The Fort Laramie Treaty, Sand Creek, Washita, and Little Bighorn all include the Cheyenne, and sometimes they wrap them in. All occurred in short grass prairies. The lack of information at Sand Creek and Washita about Travois point to the time, meaning that there was no kind of women dragging the Travois accounts, point to the time that it took to dismantle lodges and build Travois. We get much better descriptions of Travois from the less brutal in terms of the native perspective, Fort Laramie Treaty and Little Bighorn. The Travois were used to transport all sorts of different things, included the wounded and the dead. The Travois need to be seen as an essential technology. Understanding their affordances and limitations is a crucial part of understanding Native actions in Plains Indian wars. Understanding the role of travois in the wars also sheds light on the actions of women in the wars. And finally, as I was saying before, the 19th century geography of the Cheyenne and Arapaho is closely connected to modern geography.
We have plenty of time.
Howdy. Let me get my simulated Russell Westbrook glasses on. Can't afford his real ones.
Yeah.
Well, thanks to Brian and Kathy especially for inviting me to be a commenter here. I am from the geography department here on campus. I very much enjoy hanging out with historians and archaeologists and anthropologists. I have been fortunate enough to serve on a lot of history department dissertation committees. So those of you who are history grad students here, please consider me as an outside member. I learn a lot and enjoy reading the dissertations. They're so well prepared in the history department. The written paper that I read is a little bit different, but not greatly, than the presentation that Leila Monahan made here this morning. So my comments shouldn't be too different overall. One phrase she used that I didn't pick up in the paper, I might have missed it, is this idea of a dry river. I like that very much. And I'll say more about that in a bit. I found Leila Monahan's paper a very stimulating one for me to read, suggestive of so much about land and life in the Great Plains. It offers, I think, a good place to start for this workshop. In particular, we should appreciate the overall structure and ambitious agenda for the paper, which takes into account the essential mobility. And for me, that's what the paper is really about, is mobility. Blackfoot, Cheyenne, Arapaho. And we may infer all indigenous plains societies during the pre-contact and immediate post-contact time period. She's right, I think, to consider seemingly disparate topics as parts of a whole, a point I'll return to at the end, by way of a synthetic effort of both direct empirical accounts of travois, and that's kind of how I thought of when I first encountered the word. That's how I used to pronouncing it, so I'll say that. I understand both are equal in English. Travois use and how it enabled pastoral livelihood. And also indirect evidence of these circulatory worlds of the plains, as inferred from toponyms, the place names, and battle records. One of the things I like about the paper is the indication that northern plains Indians, and I would suggest all plains Indians, had regular encounters with mountains and hills, unlike the plains colonizing settlers and their descendants, whom we'll hear more about later this morning. In both the northern and southern plains, really, there are multiple ecologies, as Kathy, of course, pointed out in her introduction, on multiple kinds of landforms, not just grasslands, on even terrain. So this is the stereotype, and may dominate our senses as well. Secondly, I think the paper rightly focuses on mobility as a successful human adaptation. In this vast area, prolonged periods are not spent in any one particular place. The mobility occurs so that water, grass, animals, energy, 4 workshop themes, are are not abused, or at least that's the cultural, excuse me, that's the cultural goal. And are incorporated into the society as, in my terms, what I call a landscape assemblage. The concept of a landscape assemblage is used in many fields, including geography and ecology, but also art and architecture. Here I'm using it quite simply. Many elements of the plains, for example, are often seen as separate, distinct, and existing in different, seemingly unrelated places. So we have grasslands and antelope and a slow meandering stream over here. They're all discrete entities. And over there we have some hills or mountains, forest, deer, and a gushing river. Each is a separate thing, we say, and each has separate meaning. Each is in a separate place. But in another way of thinking, another way of seeing, they're connected, integrated, inextricably intertwined, and their meaning made richer because of it. They interpenetrate. They're related. They cannot be disassociated because they rely on each other's presence to define who they are. Landscape assemblages are a crucial part of integrative thinking, about which I'll have a bit more to say later. Living things, and from an indigenous perspective perhaps, living relatives, require periodic rest, don't we all? From all this then emerges a pace, a rhythm, a planned regularity to the kind of mobility that Lila Monahan is talking about. It's not wandering or roaming aimlessly. I'm sure everyone knows that already. So on all this, I think Lila Monahan's paper is quite clear, even if she didn't use this phrase I've thrown out, landscape assembly. That's just me.
I like it.
So the concept of home, then, on the Great Plains, is really a landscape assemblage here, not a sedentary location. And mobility is the essence of living there. I'm reminded here of an encounter with an older Spanish gentleman in Madrid. My wife is a Spanish historian here. He told me, we sleep at home, but we live in the neighborhood. Particularly Spanish orientation. In this case, the neighborhood is on the order of 25 to 30,000 square miles, according to Jim Blood's map, shown in one of the figures in this paper, and I'd love to see more of those kinds of things. Lila Monahan's paper provoked many different questions and suggestions in my mind. Most of these are just ideas that popped into my head and involve further research, some of which she suggests herself in the paper. So in no particular order here. Some of these are more minor than others. One question I had is, are there culturally specific trails? Your source, I think it was Platt, says about 2 Sioux and 3 Crow trails through the Bighorns. I don't know about that. I've never heard that. I think that's very intriguing, and how those are identified. So I'd like to learn more about that. And were the women dragging travois over mountains and over hills? That is, up and down slope extensively? Or through and around along ground that had significant soil development? In other words, very grassy versus very rocky, maybe even treacherous trails. I'd like to see a little more clarity about just getting through these numerous hilly mountainous areas of the Great Plains. I found this interpretation of the painted rawhide bag, I know them as parfleches, a French colonial term, collected by Grover, fascinating, primarily because Leila Monahan goes beyond Kroeber's functional interpretation and further into a more symbolic one. It's a richer interpretation for sure. She says it's an image of travel in the paper that I read. And as soon as I saw that, I said, yeah, it's a map. I'm a geographer and I recognize maps in any culture. No problem. And I didn't hear you use the word map for it. I want to encourage that. It's a map. And for the first time, to my knowledge, we have travel-off furrows on a map. Now, I've seen some parfleches with maps on them. I'm not sure how common they are, but there's a few around. But I've never heard of travel-off furrows. Suggests maybe a reinterpretation of some of those old artifacts. There are more of these made by different plains groups, some of which have been interpreted as maps, and I have references here. Once recognized as maps, then the history of indigenous cartography opens up. One book is Mark Warhus, Another America, in which he interprets a whole series of indigenous cartography from North America. That's pretty good. But even better is G. Malcolm Lewis, who is generally considered to be the founder and major authority on indigenous North American cartography. He has two books. One called Cartographic Encounters, which is more about the encounters between Indians and non-Indians and how these maps came about. And then he has this massive landmark entry in the History of Cartography series. Some of you may have heard of that multi-volume series out of the University of Wisconsin on the cartography of North America's indigenous peoples. Malcolm Lewis has about a 200-page chapter with about 1,000 footnotes, all focused on indigenous cartography. And I know that in some of those three, and I can't remember which one, I was furiously looking, but I ran out of time, there are parfleches. And there may be, I'm sure that there's other Blackfoot and Cheyenne cartography, maybe not very many, but some. So that's what seeing the rawhide bag led me to. I've not studied Cheyenne culture or history, so it's something of a naive question, perhaps. But I wonder if the Cheyenne range is large because, as the paper seems to suggest to me, of the ethnographically recent south-north split in the Cheyenne, or simply because it's a good way to adapt to plains life, including the ease of travel. I'll come to. It's important, perhaps crucial, to systematically traverse a very large area in the Great Plains. People still do it all the time. I admit I'm a little unsure about using battle sites as a proxy for this cultural or intracultural mobility as a characteristic of the Great Plains. It's intriguing, but I think it needs to be established rather than assumed. And the harrowing, gruesome accounts of Sand Creek, Washita, always difficult to read. But I wonder, other than curtailing the use or eliminating entirely of the travel-offs, I wonder how those accounts help us to understand mobility outside of fleeing the battle or the massacre. Last, as a geographer, I was very interested in the summary of the two preliminary lists paper of place names. They're marked as indicators of natural resources for food production, and as she notes, a preliminary setup for possible future research. I want to encourage that research because it can illuminate more about how animals, plants, bodies of water, and places have been incorporated historically and to a lesser degree contemporarily into human lives on the plains. And here there are two books that may be of use. One is the Shawnee philosopher Thomas Norton Smith's book called The Dance of Person and Place, One Interpretation of American Indian Philosophy, published 7 years ago. The other is anthropologist Tom Thornton's book, Being and Place Among the Tlingit. I've used both of these in class. The first, Norton Smith's book, proposes a set of themes that he finds consistently in the worldview, the philosophy of most, if not all, North American Indian societies. Among these are the essential relatedness that's assumed to exist among all elements of the world, a focus on integrative thinking, which is how these relations work, and importantly, an expanded sense of personhood assigned to the world's residents. That is the components of what we would normally call nature. So, for example, I'm a human person, or at least I think I am. And there are antelope persons, grass persons, hill persons, and so on. Everything has a spirit or a soul or a life force. There's a lot of different terminology that has been used, and Norton Smith talks about this. And so, too, then, one would think the places in these toponym lists would feature these principles in some way, as well as what Norton Smith calls the essential circularity of both time and places within Indian societies. And Jim Blood's map is great for showing that circularity, and Layla Monahan referred to that in terms of the nature of travel. The second book, Tom Thornton's on the Tlingit up in Alaska, has a chapter entitled What's in a Name? In it, he provides a conceptual framework for studying indigenous toponyms, one that includes the analysis of syntax. What sort of landscape features are selected for naming and what sort are not. This includes the sort of study of name density that Layla Monahan has done in a preliminary way. The idea that familiarity is shown by having more place names in an area, and where they slack off, less well known. Thornton actually calls that into question, so there's a bit of a logical dilemma there about what sort of inference can you make from places where there's more place names than others, as we saw in some of those maps. The resource function of names is important, of course, as Layla Monahan has also shown, but there can be more. For example, many Indian societies denote a kinship among places through their place names. And this, too, is part of the idea of a landscape assembly. You can have sibling or parental relationships among landforms or water features, which Norton Smith's principles anticipate through relatedness and the expanded sense of person. Indigenous place names may also refer in part or whole to the parts of a living body, a head, a mouth, an arm. This humanizes nature, we call nature, as it naturalizes the human, or form, performing an aid to integrative thinking. So as you travel, you're reminded of relationships, all of which you yourself are a part. Along these lines, then, I wonder how the sense of circularity in Blackfoot giant travel patterns that Layla Monahan discusses briefly might be enhanced and expanded. She's done a bit of that since the version of the paper that I read. I think Thornton's book on the Tlingit and perhaps the linguistic anthropologist Andrew Cowell's work on Arapaho place names, and you're not, and so you already know about this probably far more than I do,
Okay.
because he talks about place names and plants, plant sources in Colorado. Might be an easy and helpful way to expand this a little bit. And as she also notes, a more thorough check of Cheyenne and Arapaho ethnographic materials, particularly, we don't know about the completeness of Grinnell's lists. So there's, what, 123, or maybe it's a lot less than that. But how complete is that? Difficult to tell in an absolute way, but comparatively might be able to flesh that out. Okay, in terms of the implications here for the four themes, I had some thoughts. First off, it just kept hitting me again and again in the paper. It's so easy to travel on the plane. We forget this, I think, those of us who don't live that life, the more sedentary life of the academic. Versus other regions, it's a real asset of the Great Plains. By comparison, the forested environments of the East, and especially the South and the Pacific West, were regions where travel via bodies of water were often far superior than over land. And although it's not as explicit as we might like, the paper does suggest that we consider grass as a transportation surface. And that's playing off the written version, and I'm very happy to see that it is explicit. That's great. A network of roadways, the dry river idea, yeah. Whose living pavement is what I thought of. Kind of a living pavement. Eases travel enormously. And of course animals, the dog and the horse were crucial to this. And water bodies are crucial nodes in the network of trails. Interestingly, the trees so centrally needed for the travois, trees are not an obvious theme of the Great Plains. But of course they're there. And I'm thinking maybe should be a theme because of their scarcity, which makes them very valuable. Whether it's lodgepole pine from the mountains, or the birches and willows and young cottonwoods so common in the riparian habitats, north to south, they were crucial for not only the travois and teepee, but also as forest shelter for the horses in winter. I'm thinking in particular here of this area called the Big Timbers in southeast Colorado, for miles and miles along the Middle Arkansas River, heavily forested area that was used by all of the plains groups at one time or another for sheltering horses primarily. And of course the trees would not grow along the stream courses, sometimes in these great galleries along the rivers for miles, without water. So it turns out that the travois depends on water, just as the dog or the horse pulling it. In conclusion, this paper shows either directly or indirectly that the travois and movement were likely co-created in the environment of the Great Plains. The two are synthesized in the larger question of how geographic patterns of movement are embedded in a cultural system, a worldview, a plains cosmos that puts the human in relation to the living surface of the earth, and perhaps the sky, so that it is one integrated whole. All right, thank you for allowing me.
Why don't we'll just be casual and we'll open it up for questions and comments. About
I have a comment.
10 minutes. Yeah, please, Maria.
On the issue of using the records of battles and massacres for inferring certain things, and they're actually gruesome as they are unbelievably useful for making inferences on a variety of things. Like from the archaeological perspective, we have a hard time calculating demographics. from the archaeological record, because our tipping sites are very difficult to date, although they are datable. They may represent more than one occupation over the centuries, right? And they, before the advent of the GPS and all of the satellite imagery, but especially the GPS, you couldn't really map all of them as we do now. We can map 100% of a site. Before you just could. So population in the northwestern plains at the very least is grossly underestimated. But when you look at detailed information on the size and the gender of groups that were massacred, you can actually have a really good proxy as to how many people, for example, were in a certain band at a certain time of the year. Like the Baker massacre of the Blackfoot in 1870, which provides in the neighborhood of 351 people, just about, is very close to the number of people that on average would be on a single band, on a multi-family band. And then it is the same or within the range of that particular wintering camp that Anthony Henday encountered in 1754 in Alberta, in southern Alberta. So, and then when you look that back into the archaeological record, you can actually say, okay, I require these many tipper rings to actually say this is a band, right? So I find that there is a lot of different things that you can use with them. And the location where they were also allows you to pick out, where they were in the cycle of movement, right? For example, in the case of the massacre, the Baker's massacre, they were wintering. And where they were wintering, and they were in the Marias, which I believe you mentioned in that, is mentioned in that cycle. So, there's a lot of different ways in which those records can be used, perhaps not the formal battles, like the Little Bighorn, but these other, less formal battles where, people did not have a chance to hide.
Yeah, one of the things that I tried to get, but I couldn't find in time for this paper, is camp. Is problematic, but he has a list of about 40 different battles, and just looking at whether women were present or not, because I think one of the big differences between Washita and Sand Creek versus Little Bighorn is the men were not at Washita and Sand Creek because they were wintering. So the men were traveling, and the women were, holding down a sort of one place home.
Which was pretty much the case of the Baker massacre.
Yeah, and so that kind of wintering is the men traveling and the women being in one place. Whereas of course Little Bighorn, Custer thought he was going into Washita, and instead he got the summer camp with 3,000 people in it, including armed warriors, and that's how he died. Went into a summer camp rather than a winter camp. Cool, thank you.
Yeah, Julie, please.
This concept of the travois being used on this dry river and grass as a transportation surface, as Robert pointed out, is really fascinating. And I know your focus is the short grass. My mind, of course, goes to the tall grass, always. And I wonder, I had never thought about the travois not being useful in the tall grass. So do you have any idea of what they used, what replaced it or was used instead, pre-horse, instead of the travois? And and just, I keep thinking about so often the tall grass kind of falls into this vacuum between the Midwest and the drier plains, and this seems to be another case where, it's still grassland, but the way mobility works is so different in the tall grass. So I don't know. I know it's not your focus, but have you come across anything about the tall grass and how the travois did or did not fit in?
I don't know. That you have historical accounts of the Cheyenne around the Missouri. So, like the people interviewed by Grinnell, the people who George Bent, who's from my mind, the best source of history for this time, the Bent family, that he talks about, men remembering their mothers growing corn along the Missouri, right? And I think that it's a completely different lifestyle. It's a completely different life way before people move on, are sort of pushed away from the Missouri River and the good farmlands onto the plains for the Cheyenne. And I suspect that they didn't pick up the travois until you got onto the plains, and it sort of was thought as the sort of change between a pedestrian culture to, sort of a horse culture. But that swap wasn't only that, oh look, the men can go hunt buffalo. It's that, oh look, the women can travel up and down the dry river. And so I think that you had some of the use of the technology before with dogs, but dogs don't travel as far, dogs don't carry as much. And so I suspect that there was always a kind of a migration within the like there's sort of early tales are of you have your farm fields and then you go out and you hunt buffalo as a community, and it's both men and women, and then you come back again. So there's always travel, but the kind of travel changed with the travois, which is something that shows up in Bethke's dissertation.
Thank you.
So I was interested in it as like a gender technology, and one of the terms that I don't think gets used, but that's like throughout, is like the division of labor. And I'm wondering if it changes. When you talk about them being used as ambulances and things, is that like a new role for some of these women in some of these communities, and that technology helps them to take on that role, or is that something that they've kind of always done?
I think that like my starting point is the battle. So it's sort of like I have an odd in starting point, and if you look at the sort of male technology of the American Army, everything that needs to be done is done by men, right? So the men fight, but they're also the cooks and the saddlers, and the only thing they don't do is the washing, right? The only women that show up are the washerwomen. But when you look at the kind of warrior culture of the Great Plains, men did not do the cooking. That sort of Edmund Guerrier's "The Squaws in My Lodge." It wasn't his lodge. It was his It was his female relative's lodge, and so you don't have a lodge without women in it, right? But in some ways that freed the men up because they didn't need a place to stay. They didn't need something to eat. The sort of descriptions of Cheyenne warriors and Lakota warriors of this generation they were some of the great fighters of all time, in part because they were way better trained than the 18-year-olds that came over from the East, who were the kind of the military fodder in the wars at that point. You had the Civil War, which sort of wiped out a generation of American men. And so the warriors, the Little Bighorn, the description of the privates fighting at Little Bighorn were these unprepared guys, and that was absolutely the opposite of the Cheyenne. But my argument, in my sort of thesis about that is basically that they were such quarter warriors because everything was done by the women for them, which is kind of like it's a sort of different way to look at the drudge image that shows up for the women. It's that the women had a sphere and they were very, very competent in that sphere, and that included supporting the men in warfare. And that little Grinnell quote that I had about girls with the travois, the longer quote of that is that they would play that the girls would set up camp, and if other sort of groups would attack that camp, and the girls, if they thought they were losing, they would pack up their camp and they would run away. And so this threat of war is something that they were aware of from a very early age. And so it's a sort of complex of, we need you to protect us so our home isn't attacked.
Let's take one more question, Josh.
I guess I have a question about whether or not the travois was unique to the North American short-term short grass prairie. Is there any record of this, say in the Russian steppes or similar technology or
Oh, interesting.
process?
I
We
don't
have
know.
a Russian historian with us, yeah.
Yes.
But I know nothing.
And I guess also, you mentioned in response to an earlier question about they picked it up when they became more of a nomadic, adopted more of a nomadic lifestyle. Did it exist? Like
Well,
when can we date?
you have dog travois, right? So, and that Henderson sort of talks about how dog travois are the model for horse travois. And in fact, the name for horse in some native cultures is big dog, right? So that the kind of, the little version is scaled up. And when that scaling up happens, you get bigger houses, because you all of a sudden have these tall poles that you can use for teepee. You get more stuff because your travois can pull more stuff. So there's a kind of incipient technology there that is then, sort of like bigger, better once the horse comes in.
Well, as Bob said, I think this was a great paper to start because it really does integrate the four themes so well. Grasses, water, animals are obvious, but we, in today's society, we tend to think of energy as fossil fuels. The reality is, for most of human history, energy came from animals or moving water. And so I think this was really a fascinating way for us to start. And I want to thank Leila for a wonderful paper and Bob for a great commentary. Thank you. So they brought in some fresh coffee. There may be some left in the original pot. And we'll start up again at 11. Thank you.